This is lecture 11A for History 111. We're going to talk about the Muslim world now, and this is a big story. It will really shape a whole lot of things going forward in history. Essentially, the Arabian Peninsula was kind of a backwater through a lot of the story of history that we've been talking about so far. It's actually really large. It's about 30,000 square miles bigger than Greenland. But it's mostly desert in the center. It's got some oases in it, places where there are fertile patches because there's groundwater coming up through springs and things. And it's got some very fertile strips along the southern edge and then around the coastlines, essentially. But the middle of it is largely desert, and because of that, the Arabian Peninsula really didn't have any large kingdoms, any large cities. It was sort of living on the periphery of the Egyptian, Syrian, Mesopotamian civilizations, and the people living in the Arabian Peninsula were largely pastoralists. They herded sheep, camels, goats, etc., and they moved around from oasis to oasis, etc. Now there were some places that did settled agriculture because there were some places that were fertile enough to do agriculture, but for the most part, people were nomadic. They moved around following their herds, trying to find food for their herds. And so that's pretty much how it existed for centuries before the rise of Islam. But beginning in the 500s and 600s, you began to see some changes happening. Now, there had always been some trade routes running up the Arabian Peninsula. In particular, some form of incense, like frankincense, were grown in southern Arabia, in the southern Arabian Peninsula, and there were trade routes that run up basically up the western edge of the Arabian Peninsula. And so there were some smaller trading cities along there, including Mecca and Medina. But they had never been major trading routes. However, in the 500s and 600s, two things happened that really began to make the Arabian Peninsula much more important. The first is that 100 years long war between the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Empire really devastated parts of Syria and Lebanon, and that was some of the major trade routes. And so a lot of merchants began to bypass that area and to go up the Arabian Peninsula to avoid the war zone, essentially. And then the Justinian plague breaks out in the 500s, and that also drives merchants to try to avoid the big cities where the plague is the most prevalent, and they start to go through the Arabian Peninsula because there aren't that many people there. But of course, over time, this begins to shift. The Arabian Peninsula begins to grow. Mecca begins to grow. Medina begins to grow. There's more trade and camel caravans along the Arabian Peninsula there. And so the Arabian Peninsula was sort of becoming more integrated into global trade networks. It was becoming more populated. You began to see merchants from elsewhere begin to move to Mecca and Medina to establish trading posts there. And so the Arabian Peninsula began to sort of pick up economically. Now, one of the results of that is that the city of Mecca became much bigger and more prominent. Now, Mecca was an interesting place. In Mecca, there's a black, glassy rock set in the earth. Nobody's ever scientifically analyzed it. We don't know what it is. Some people speculated it might be the remains of a meteorite that hit millions of years ago. But it's a black, glassy rock, and it's pretty big. And the people in the Arabian Peninsula tended to practice religions that were sort of like the transactional religions I talked about. They tended to think of different sorts of places, a spring or a mountain or an oasis or whatever, as having spirits that inhabited and protected that place, and you could pray to those spirits, give them offerings, ask them for favors, that sort of thing. And so this black rock, because it was so unique, became a shrine for Arabs who came there to ask for favors, bring me children, let me get pregnant, end my father's illness, bring, prosperity to the family, whatever. And so Mecca actually became this sort of site of religious pilgrimage. People from all over the Arabian Peninsula would come to Mecca to pray at this shrine. And in fact, there were about nobody agreed on what was actually, what God lived in the rock or whatever. And so there were actually about 360 little religious shrines for different approaches to this shrine. But Mecca made a lot of money as a tourist center. And in fact, because of that rock, Mecca also was interesting because in the culture of the Arabian Peninsula, there was a lot of vendettas between clans and tribes. There wasn't a strong central government, and so people generally relied on their families, their clans, and their tribes. Now, families would be clumped together. Families that were related to each other would be clumped together into clans, and each clan generally had a male head who was recognized as the head of the clan. And then clans were connected through lineage into tribes. And so you basically counted on your family and your clan to protect you. And so there were often vendettas where one person would steal somebody else's sheep, and then their relatives would steal sheep's back, and then it would turn into and somebody would kill somebody, and they would turn into a war. And the only way you could settle that sort of vendetta, that sort of feud between two clans, was to find neutral territory and then negotiate who was going to give what to whom to settle this. And this religious shrine became a site that people said, well, you can go there and there's no fighting allowed at the religious shrine, so it's a place you can go to negotiate with your enemies, knowing they won't attack you there and you won't attack them there, and you can actually negotiate. So Mecca became this sort of cultural religious center. And Mecca was under the control of the Umayyad clan, and they're going to be important, keep track of them. The Umayyad clan, which was part of the Quraysh tribe. And the Umayyads were one of the most powerful clans in the Arabian Peninsula because they controlled Mecca. And they made a lot of money off of several things. One is the religious shrines. You know, they controlled inns and things like that, and people would stay in the inns when they went to the shrine. But they also they provided protection services for camel caravans coming into and out of Mecca. And so the Umayyads had a good thing going on here, right? Now, in the middle of this, in 570, a young man named Muhammad ibn Abdullah was born. Now, Muhammad ibn Abdullah was also a member of the Quraysh tribe, but he was from a much smaller clan inside that tribe, the Banu Hashim clan. And because of that, his clan was not nearly as powerful or as wealthy as the Umayyads. But Muhammad ibn Abdullah had some serious disadvantages in life because his father died before he was born, and then his mother died when he was a young child. And so he was left an orphan. And in a society that's built around families, clans, and tribes, and there's no central government, it's really a disadvantage to be an orphan because you don't have the protection of a family. All right? Now, he got taken in by an uncle. And the uncle was pretty wealthy. And so the uncle raised him, but the uncle is not going to give him a big inheritance or anything like that. The uncle is just going to give him some protection and food and clothing until he's an adult. So when Muhammad became an adult, he basically he had to support himself, and he didn't have the money to start a business or anything. So he did what a lot of young men did. He became a camel driver. And he would basically get hired by merchants to take camel caravans up and down the Arabian Peninsula from Egypt in the north down to modern-day Yemen or Oman or whatever. And so he passed back and forth through Mecca quite a bit. But he got to see a fair amount of the world. He got to go up to perhaps Damascus and see bigger cities and Greek culture, etc. But his prospects were not great because as a camel driver, he didn't have any family connections that could help him in business. He didn't have any money to get started in a business. But he got extremely fortunate in that he met a widow named Khadijah. Khadijah was a bit older than Muhammad, 10, 15 years older. And she was a widow, and her husband had been a merchant. And when he died, she had not had any sons. And so she was running the business herself. And this was a really difficult thing for a woman at that time because this was a patriarchal society that saw women really as second-class citizens, and a lot of men didn't think they had to deal with Khadijah, or they thought it was okay to rip her off. And so she really struggled just because of discrimination against her because of her sex. So she and Muhammad met, and they clicked, and they decided to get married, and this allowed Muhammad to become the sort of male head of her business. And so he could deal with people, and they would deal with a man, and they didn't have the disadvantage of Khadijah being a woman. But Khadijah remained involved with the business. She and Muhammad really seemed, for all the evidence we have, they really seemed to treat each other as partners, to treat each other more or less equally, and he really respected her advice. So with this, Muhammad becomes almost overnight, when he marries her, a fairly well-established merchant. But he gained a reputation over a number of years of being really a stand-up guy, in the sense that you knew you could trust him to carry through on a contract. He would, if he said he was going to do something, he would do something. And so he became a fairly well-respected merchant in the Meccan community. But then everything changed in 610 when he was about 40 years old. We'll find out about that in the next part of the lecture.